Hey everybody, go to my website, theostomyguy.com. Order my book, Memoirs of a Bagman, The Ostomy Guy Story. There's a button on there that says buy now. It'll take you to Amazon, or you can go straight to amazon.com. Memoirs of a Bagman, The Ostomy Guy Story. Check it out. Hey everybody, welcome to the Ostomy Guy Podcast. I'm your host, Austin, the OG. First off, I want to just say thank you to everyone who listens, who keeps coming back here. Unlike my family, who gets annoyed at hearing my voice all the time, apparently you aren't too annoyed by it, but I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for your letters. I get letters from people who have read my book, people who listen to these podcasts, and it is unbelievable hearing the stories of just how listening to somebody else's life, what's going on when they're being real, the struggles that other people are going to, how that liberates just by listening to them through this podcast and through reading my story, through my book, and I really appreciate it. So keep it up. I love hearing from you. I love all of your stories. The reason that I started this podcast was to hopefully shine light into this dark world that we all live in. And when we share our stories and listen carefully to those around us, it is obvious that there's beauty in this world. And it very seriously comes from opening our ears and beginning to learn to sympathize with those around us, because we're all struggling through something. And oftentimes it takes seeing the world through someone else's eyes to appreciate what's actually right in front of us. And today we're visiting with a good friend of mine, Dan Oblinger. Dan is how should I say, you're now a veteran hostage negotiator, I would say. Author of now 2 books, Life or Death Listening and The 28 Laws of Listening. You're a corporate trainer. You're an HR consultant. You're an expert listener. So another way of saying that, you are the man of many women's dreams as an expert listener.
Ooh, well,
is that far-fetched?
Yes. Oh, I've never been introduced like that.
A jack of all trades.
Master of some, yeah.
From a chicken rancher to a doodling expert. Dan is first and foremost a husband and a father of 5 adopted children. And he's a gentleman in the most honorable sense of the word, and I'm proud to call him my friend. Dan, welcome. This is super cool. I'm really glad we actually finally got to sit down and do this. So thanks for coming, man.
Yeah, I feel blessed.
And you brought Ray.
Yes, I did. I brought Little Man. He's off microphone, but yeah.
He's over there.
Usually my sidekick in these kind of adventures.
Well, thanks for coming, Ray. Hey, so why don't you tell our listeners, I want to hear from your mouth how we know each other, how you know me, what your recollection is of me.
Our first meeting? Is that what you want?
Not necessarily, but we've been around each other since we were little. We weren't friends necessarily, but we've known each other. We've run around the same communities.
I think contemporary would be the word, right?
That's right.
We were in a lot of the same communities because we're the same age. We had some mutual friends.
Yep.
And we were at different places in our lives at different times. But we were occupying the same space and time a couple times.
Yeah.
So, but I would say that truly it was not until we both had a Catholic awakening that we really met.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember any other time that we met specifically besides the basketball game. So,
and then a certain bachelor party in Kansas City.
Oh yeah. I totally forgot about that.
Yeah, I didn't.
I almost still forget about that. So, I was on. It might have been a 2-day bender. I was not in a really good place.
It's a good plug for the book. This is a great story in the book.
I don't know what page it's on, but the story's in there. Maybe I'll tell it anyways. But so I had been out hanging out with friends. We'd spent the day doing things we shouldn't, hanging out, drinking, fooling around, doing whatever. And I ended up going to my old high school. I was probably 22 years old. I went to my old high school, maybe 23, doesn't matter. Went to my old high school basketball game, a varsity basketball game, and I had drank a little bit too much and was pretty belligerent and was hanging out with my friends trying to keep a low pro, which is very hard for me because I got a loud voice, I got an outgoing personality, and I love attention, and you can't keep a low pro when those are three strong qualities. So,
and you're at your alma mater.
That's right.
At a big game. I think that was Bishop Carroll Capon, I think.
It was the Holy War. It was Bishop Carroll versus Capon. And I went over to see a buddy of mine who was a senior and say hi to him. And I got up in the student section and slapping hands and fooling around. And the cop, who was, some weekend cop that was just hired by the school to watch the door, make sure no idiots come in or out, walks over to the student section where I'm at. And he calls me down, and I walk down there to talk to him, and he sniffs me out right away and knows, he's been drinking. So he tells me, I don't know if you remember what you told me or how much about the situation, but he basically called me out and told me I was going to have to leave and walked me out the door.
Yeah. Yeah. It was fairly uneventful, but it was the who, not the what of the story that becomes powerful, I think, later.
So then I left there and walked. It was, a half mile from Capon around the corner to the Shadow, and sat over at the Shadow and kept doing what I was doing all day long till my buddies came and met up with me. And lo and behold, me and Dan hook up a number of years later, once again through some other friends' circles, after both of us had some pretty major life conversions. And we just we hit it off. We both we got our eye on the ball, and we're both really hard workers, and we find ourselves kind of running into each other and the same people in this community, in the business community, in the Catholic community in Wichita. You tend to run into the same people as you kind of move up and around different circles, and so we've kind of gotten to know each other pretty darn well. Mm-hmm. So welcome to the party.
From inauspicious beginnings, right? God can do a lot of work in the meantime.
All right, so reflect back real quick, and whether you remember or not, it doesn't matter, but anybody like me, where I was at, what did you see in me at that time? That same kid, any kid like that, where I was at 22? Because I know where I was, but what is your observation of that kid?
That kid was unremarkable in a sense, right?
Yeah. Because,
as a police officer, you deal with so many people that drink too much, put themselves in situations they really ought not be in. And if anything was remarkable, it was that you were actually very kind. Like, you didn't fight. You didn't, you just, I know. You didn't like it. You grumbled, but you just left, right? So it's pretty unremarkable. In fact, didn't even do a police report on it. Just, all right, that happened. The principal's like, I don't think he should be here. And sniff, and yep, he's gone, right? He's gone forever. But that's not how God works. That's the grace of God, right? Is that, again, from otherwise unremarkable beginnings, he can develop, say, friendship. And he can send people careening into a totally different trajectory in their life with, really simple events or sufferings.
Man, right then, I was on my way to like the worst time in my life.
Right.
From then, for another year and a half, 2-3 years maybe. That was the beginning of a really rough time. And I was, as nice as I was, as much fun as I like to have, I was broken. That was all a facade. That was all such a fake, phony version of who I was and what was really going on in my life. Yeah, what an amazing time. Mm-hmm. It was a lot of fun, but it was just one of those things. My dad, I think who is that? That's Frank Sinatra. It was fun. It was just one.
It was just one
of those things. Okay, so you focus a lot of your time and energy on helping businesses, helping organizations begin to have a culture of listening. And I've worked in a number of big companies. I run my own business now. My family is its own little network.
Yes.
And listening is like I talk a lot, Dan. I listen little. Like I got to make myself.
It's kind of the American dream.
Do it.
You know?
Right. Right.
Let me tell you something, buddy.
That's exactly right. That's me.
I got something to say about that.
I have too much to say. And so listening is something that I've always, every spiritual director I've ever had when it comes to like my marriage and has always, it's this constant, my awareness that I have to try and listen, even when I don't want to, even though I don't like to do it. It's the making myself do it. And I've slowly gotten better. April may have her opinion on that.
She's not here, so we'll just go with what you say.
I've gotten phenomenally better as I've worked on it. And how and why is in your line of work is listening so important, and why have you come to kind of hyper focus your energy on helping spread that awareness to people at all areas of life, all the way to the very tippy top? How come, and where does that come from? Where's that inspiration come from?
I remember reading a book, and I would guess a lot of your listeners have read this book. Shel Silverstein wrote it. It's called The Missing Piece. And it's a fairly abstract book. It's about a geometric shape that roams throughout the book through the course of the storytelling and the narrative. I think listening's the missing piece. I think when you look at, I'll just pick one because a good friend of mine and my father's brought it up to my attention this week. Civil discourse in our society, how we govern ourselves. The missing piece is listening. You can take any political topic where anybody has any kind of passion about that topic on each side, and no one's listening to each other. You could take management and leadership of a corporation, of a business, and examine the dynamics inside the corporation, and what you'll find is a deficit of listening. There are good ideas at the bottom of the organization, great ideas that would make tons of money and open up all kinds of new revenue, and no one's listening to the people closest to the problem and the process and the principles, and so we don't take advantage of those. Similarly, there are obstacles facing the people at the top of the hierarchy, and because they don't listen to each other and listen to really key people in that culture, they don't have the best data to make the decision. And when you look at families, that's the missing piece in our society. Families are falling apart, and I think largely it's because no one's being taught about the duty and the privilege of listening well to each other. So if all I can accomplish is a few other people get excited about listening as a skill and learn the basic techniques, like the building blocks of great listening, and they can master the skill of listening and save their family, then it was worth all the trouble.
When I was younger, I had I grew up in a big family. I'd say that I had an unlimited number of ears around me to listen. I'm very fortunate. My parents were always open to listening, more my mom, but they're always open to listening to anything that I had to say or share or whatever in regards to something serious or something that was going on in my life. And I struggled sharing. Okay. So my problem, I had willing listeners around me, but I didn't want to share any of it. So how do you balance that? And or how does a parent or a sibling of someone who's dealing with something or whatever, how do you begin to open up that person?
Yes, it's a proper understanding of what listening is. People get sideways with listening so fast because we don't define terms well. we aren't clear and really concise in how we define activities that are really important.
What do you mean by defined terms?
I think if I said, hey, listen, what's listening? I think most people would begin to describe it as an activity that's passive. They would describe it as a reception of sorts, like I'm receiving your story, which, it's not entirely wrong, but it completely misses the mark in terms of how do you become a better listener. If you think it's passive and I said become a better listener, what's that mean? You speak less, I suppose. And there's a really good purpose to speaking less, but it has to be strategically less. So this is my thing: is listening's not passive at all. Listening's active. Listening is an activity, like it's in the description, right? And the reason I know this is because there are tons of people that are not sharing their story. In fact, most people won't share their story anymore in our society with you. Now, they'll give you their curated social media feed. They'll give you their Instagram, but that's not their story
at all.
That is the face they put on for the world. Yeah. And I will tell you, it's destroying us. What the story is, this is a really important concept. It's in my book, in all my workshops, in my trainings, and my keynote speaking. Whenever I come in and consult with a corporation, this is a really critical thing to transmit to them, is that everyone in their organization has a story. And the story begins before they're born. It has to do with what kind of environment they were born into. And that story continued. Everything that they ever experienced in their life is wrapped up in the story. Every trauma, every drama, every success, every hope, every dream, it's a part of the story. The story is everything that's happened to them. It's everything that's going through their mind right now. It's everything they're dealing with on Monday this week. And it's everything about where they want to be in 2-10 years and who's there with them. That's an important part of the story. And in terms of that story is so critical. That story is how we see ourselves. That story of self is how we share ourselves with the world, and we're afraid. And so what you find is, and I'll just ask you, when's the last time that somebody in your life invited that story and then treated it with respect? And because we're not doing that, we don't have true human relationships, and we don't have strong, resilient cultures, whether that's a business, a community, or a family. And so listening is the activity where we invite the story honestly and earnestly, and then we treat it with respect, because when we respect the story, we respect the person. That's how important our story is to us.
I've learned that in myself, in my own way of practicing that, it develops. One thing I really struggle with having health problems is that I struggle empathizing with other people.
Sure.
I have a very hard time hearing somebody with some ailments or issues going on.
My head hurts.
And feeling compassion and putting myself there with them and actively listening and making myself. I mean, this is in the same way with my bride is that when I make myself listen and begin to care, my empathy has grown tremendously. Whether I want it to or not, I am way more sensitive toward the sufferings and needs and joys of other people, rather than always looking back at myself, being so turned inward, where I'm always reflecting toward, well, that's not like what I went through, or I've had more fun than that, or I've been here. I'm now able to slow down and connect and find their joy, which is actually telling me a whole lot about that person, what brings them joy, what's made them who they are.
Sure. That's the story, man. That's it right there.
And then I actually begin to care.
You have to be a good listener to sell people on the fact that you actually want that story. I would say this, because you brought it up. There's a special relationship between proper listening and empathy. It's empathy in motion. One thing, I work with a lot of leaders, a lot of people with authority in these companies. And one struggle is I think they know that empathy is important, and they're being told it's a leadership skill. And that's really dangerous, actually. It can be really, at the low end of the danger spectrum, it's distracting. But at the high end, you can damage teams. Because if I told you, I mean, if you believe that, if empathy is a skill, and I said, well, you need to be more empathetic, then what do? You double down on empathy, but what that comes across as is very inauthentic. I mean, if empathy is saying, hey, I care about you, Does it mean if you double down on that, you're like, hey, I really care about you?
Yeah.
That's not empathy.
Right.
I think empathy is a perception that forms in somebody else's mind about you. And it's really on the basis of your behavior. And the principal behavior we use to judge whether somebody else cares about us is do they listen to us?
Yeah.
That's the special relationship. What we tell police officers when we're training them to be hostage negotiators is that there's such a thing as tactical listening or tactical empathy. And it's empathy that's directed at the other person, which is what you're describing properly. It's directed at the other person. It seeks to understand what they know. It seeks to see their world through their eyes because there's no other way to see it. Mm-hmm. And the cool thing is that's a really useful kind of empathy for you, the listener, because you gain knowledge and you demonstrate care and understanding, but for the other person too, because one of the most powerful things you can do for another human person is invite them to tell their story and not interrupt them or hijack it.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of listening that hostage negotiators use. When I run into other people kind of in that corporate space that don't have that like really authentic experience of life or death listening, they'll often talk about, well, empathy is feeling somebody else's feelings. I'm like, that's not very useful. And it's actually directed fairly inward as a listener because you're trying to feel like they feel. Mm-hmm. So you're really focused on your own emotions. And if you were to accomplish that, what have you got? Yeah. If they're really sad, we have two really sad people. Like, I'd rather have a sad person because that's real, that's honest, and somebody that's in a position of safety that can talk them and listen to them until they feel better. Like, that's maybe a better model. That's what negotiators do. Mm-hmm. But I often see people kind of get sideways with empathy, thinking that it's either sympathy or what some people call emotive or emotional empathy, where we try to feel their feelings. And we don't want our negotiators to do that.
Yeah.
Because that's emotional contagion. That's really dangerous for us. We meet people in extreme negative emotional syndromes. So we don't want to feel what they feel. We want to open a window and throw some light into the room, right? With listening. That's what we want to do.
Yeah.
So in that case, really great listening has a special relationship with really great empathy, the kind of empathy that can help people.
So when our first daughter was born, it was a traumatic delivery. She was taken away immediately to the NICU. Mm-hmm. My wife and she was just distraught. I mean, outside of having her first child and being in labor for 22 hours, 24 hours, something like that, and then giving birth and then that baby not breathing right and having a broken clavicle, broken ankle, a number of issues, and then getting taken away, she was beside herself. And it was almost like second nature to me at that moment I'm used to being in traumatic moments in the hospital and dealing with the unknown and being okay with the unknown. And at the time, she was resistant because she wanted me to come down to her level. But she'll tell you over and over from the week we got out of the hospital to today that it was that understanding that I was there with her, but also helping carry her out of it and through it. And she's done that for me in a number of ways in other areas in our relationship and in our life.
That's a beautiful image for marriage.
That's been so, vital for her and I's success, just as a couple, as friends, because where I'm weak, she sees it and steps up, and it just naturally happened. As you're saying this, I was just thinking of that moment, and it just naturally happened. And we both kind of reflect on that every once in a while, how beautiful that is to be able to have each other, to be able to stomp through those things. But it was the recognizing that it was happening so quickly after that was beautiful. That's really cool.
Mm-hmm. Great image.
Okay. So what if I'm listening to 3 different people, like when I was writing my book? And I'm sitting there and I'm trying to figure out, I got a big decision I've got to make, and I'm talking to, say, my dad, who has a very strong opinion based on his experience to do this, and this is what's going to be best for me. But then also I've got someone else in my life who, to the same question, would say, so in regards to like the cover of my book, how I had it, his recommendation might have been this. And then someone with the publisher is saying, our experience is this, and that's why it's a strong recommendation to the opposite. And then my wife, who would say, you know, neither of those two really reflect what you're all about, Austin. I think you should stick with your original idea here. So now I'm sitting here listening to three people that I really trust, and I know how much they bring to the table in regards to the information that they're giving me and how much they care about me. So how do I begin? I know what I did, but how do you begin? How do you begin stomping through, getting rid of two of those and picking one, or making a decision? When you have several people who are giving you valid information on something, and I think I know what your answer is.
May not. I'm making it up as I go. I think, well, one thing, like I'll just put my negotiator brain on and tell you what a negotiator would say. The negotiator would say, whenever somebody gives you advice or anybody makes a demand upon you, either way, that's their position. And what we've learned is the positions tend to be inflexible. Positions tend to be tightly held, and it tends to be a waste of your time and effort to try to change someone's position. So, for instance, if one of them gave you advice and you did not like it at all, it would probably be a waste of your time and effort to try to change their advice to you. You're just going to either take it or not, right? But negotiators know this. It's really important to explore the interest of someone who has a position. And the interest is what forms the position. It's their perspective, their information that they possess, their past experiences in those kind of related events. So what we do is we acknowledge the position, we ensure that we understand it properly, and then we just set that aside or move around it, and we start inquiring about the interest. So, for instance, if your father's like, oh, it needs to be this, that's his position, and so as a good listener, you're going to listen.
You met
to
my
him.
dad.
I have. You're going to say, hey, pops, why? Tell me about that. Why you seem really certain about that? What made you form that that position? And explore it with him, and then repeat that process with all these folks that are advising you in your life. And you'll have a much better idea of how the positions were formed and whether they're going to be relevant for what you're trying to accomplish with the project. And then you should just listen to your wife.
Which is what I did.
Yeah. Happy wife, happy life. No, I think too, sometimes it's a matter of taste. So the cover of your book probably is going to need to be something that you can live with. It won't bother your dad as much if the cover is not how he would have it when it's not his book.
Right.
So, and he's a good dude, so he'll probably get over it. So
he's over it.
Yeah.
He wanted me to go the direction that you went on your cover. I think I've told you that.
Which I'm happy with my cover, and it could have gone 10 different ways. It really is about what's inside the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. When you're not,
You gotta keep
when you're not
telling
writing
them.
for Penguin or Tan
Right.
or something,
Right.
Yeah. Be true. To thine own self be true. Mr. Powers.
Right. That's exactly right. Okay. So a little more serious topic, or at least question, but touching on on the same subject of having a parent or a sibling with a child that is struggling with something but not opening up about it. People who have the issues that I deal with, people who struggle with chronic illness. So kids are getting younger and younger when they're being diagnosed with Crohn's. I was diagnosed when I was 10, and it was incredibly rare back in the early 90s. And now that's just the norm. It's between like 8 and 16 years old. And these kids, especially now in the social media world, where we're portraying this life, this duplicitous life where everything seems so good and is a certain way, but our reality is totally contrast to that. How, and this is touching on the epidemic of teen depression and anxiety that we have. How do we begin? How does a sibling or a parent begin to open up that conversation? Maybe touch on again how, in a real authentic way, we can begin to communicate with our loved ones that'll help invite them to tell their story. And we're talking about families here, right? So in my own life, whether my family's listening to this or not, I don't want to give away my secrets, but like in my own life, I have 7 siblings. You get along with some of them, you don't get along with some of them. It kind of goes in ebbs and flows.
Yeah, and it waxes and wanes.
And there are times like when my brother Rob and I, we hated each other. We couldn't even hardly hang out with each other without getting into it. I mean, it was bad. And I had to stay away from him for a while and began, by the recommendation of a wonderful priest here in Wichita, to pray for him every day. And not for him to change, but for me to learn.
That is spiritual growth.
Yes, but for me to learn to love him the way he is.
Yeah.
And not to change him. For me to come to this understanding that, you know what, that's just how he is, and I need to be fine with that and learn to hang around. And so, I mean, dude, my wife and I, our first year together, she'd be like, why do you go hang out with him?
Yeah.
She's like, why do you go put up with that? And I'm like,
because he's my brother.
Because
he's my brother.
I love him. I can go take it on the chin from him. Yeah. You know what? I can just go do it. And I am fine and am totally okay being in that position in any relationship. And that's how I have, him and I are dear friends now, where we went from hating each other. I was the best man in his wedding.
Right.
6 years later. I mean, that 6 years, 365 days a year, a rosary every day.
Well, that'll do it.
That's a lot of time in praying for me to learn to love the guy.
Yes.
And real change happens. So I say that, meaning I just went totally selfless and was others focused completely and all on his terms. It was always on his terms. And we worked our way back together. And what didn't exist before, he'll swing by my house. I'll swing by his. Our kids will hang out. We have a cool relationship. But how can somebody who's listening, who has a family member who's dealing with this from your practice, be able to incorporate some of your active listening skills just in a simple way with family members that are hard to crack?
Well, there's the lessons in your story, you and Rob's story, right? If you're asking me on the basis of all my experience, certainly as a husband and father and someone who really seeks to be wise, which maybe someday I will be, but also in 18 years of really intense, dedicated service as a law enforcement officer, and about a decade as a hostage negotiator, you know what repairs broken relationships is radical humility on the part of one party. And that's kind of a really beautiful thing too. And it's scriptural, and Jesus lived that, is that everybody says, well, it takes 2 to have a good relationship. It takes 2 to tango. And I'm like, that's true in a sense, because we both have duties and obligations in a relationship. But one person, look at St. Monica, one person can repair a relationship if they're willing to be humble enough, if they're willing to suffer enough. And that's for all your parents out there, because I'm learning that's the hardest part of being a parent, is you want the best for your kid or kids, and you can't make them pick it. You can pray as hard as you'd like for virtuous children, but they are going to have to make thousands and thousands of good decisions as they become adults to build that kind of virtue. And so the only thing you can offer them after being a good model with your own behavior is just radical humility. So the lesson within listening, like within my book, would be going back to kind of this idea that people judge your authenticity as a listener and as a leader on the basis of how you ask questions. If I come to you, Austin, and I say, hey, you had a great day today, right? Is that even a question?
No, you're projecting.
Yeah. I'm telling you how to answer my question, which means I don't trust you, Austin, to answer my question, which means you, Austin, shouldn't trust me as the questioner, as a leader, and as a listener. And people get this. It's intuitive. You don't need to read my book to be like, I don't trust people that interject the answer I'm supposed to provide with the question when they ask me. We instinctively flee from those kind of leaders. So as parents, are you asking your kids those kind of questions? Like, did you have a good day today, right? Hey, you're doing good, right? Hey, that was tough, but I'm sure you're fine now, right? Like, you're not inviting the story of how they're actually going, right? So we have to get better at just letting kids know that it's okay to tell us that everything sucks. And because then and only then, again, that's their position, then and only then can you explore the interest. Okay, why? How come? What's going on? What's your biggest fear right now? What's got you up at night, right? Why don't you, if you could go anywhere but school today, where would you go? Instead of saying, how was school? Right? If you could change one thing about your high school, what would it be? And how they answer that question, first and foremost, they'll know you're serious about that conversation. But secondly, how they answer it, that might surprise you. And so this brings us to the learning lesson here is, with your questions, you can do one of two things. You can inquire genuinely. You can encounter people, you can meet them right where they're at, and you can have zero control over the conversation because they will tell you something that will completely flip your lid when you ask a great question and let them tell the story. Or, and this is how a lot of parents, including myself, are tempted to use questioning, we can be advocates with our questions. We can insinuate how we hope someone answers the question. We can prove a point with a question. We can lead people down a fairly narrow path of questioning with questions. I think of Socrates, right, in Athens. I would. And his Elenchus, right? So it begins usually with a couple open-ended questions, but when he realizes somebody is posing as a wise person when they are not, he's asking them questions knowing the answer, and he's asking it in such a way that they can only answer truthfully. And at the end of it, they're proven to be a fool. And I say, that's amazing. It's true. But they killed him because he didn't build relationships with people. And he wasn't helping people become better. He had a singular purpose to discover wisdom, and he didn't. So, now, I love Socrates, right?
Right.
But he's not a good model for inviting people's stories and discovering them. What I found in law enforcement was the more time I took with people that I didn't like, to really inquire about their story and kind of see where they were coming from and all the traumas that had happened to them. It didn't excuse any of their behavior, but I understood them better. Yeah. And I loved them more. And I think that's it. If you have someone in your life right now, kind of stepping away from the kind of your kid issue, but like going back to kind of like your brother or anybody in your life that just causes you consternation, it's probably because you don't know them well enough. If you could encounter them somehow and ask a couple of earnest, honest questions, it might be easier to pray for them in a way that's really beautiful. So, and that is the definition of love, is to will that other person's good. And it's hard to do when we can get wrapped around their personality and how much it grates on us.
Yeah. See, and I'd compliment that with what I got. It wasn't like all those prayers for all that time. They were absolutely not for Rob, for my brother. They were for me. For me to learn to grow. And I realized I was the one with the problem. Yeah. That's where it was. It wasn't in him. It never was. It was always inside of me. And I was only able to really have compassion and learn about him when that slowly eroded away. Yeah. And I began to have open ears and I knew him. And when I knew him, I understood how he made decisions, why he was and acted the way that he did or didn't, and vice versa. And him and I being able to spend time together. And so the change took place in me. Yeah. Which was the beautiful thing about it. It was, I mean, that's bizarre how God works. But it's freaking cool because now I can apply that to so many other relationships and people in my life, and it's consistent everywhere, to constantly be looking for ways that I can grow. Fulton Sheen says, even when you're right, you're wrong in pride. And I've always loved that line. It's so beautiful because it's always looking for how I can change and not how I can make someone else do the changing.
Yeah, and you know what? Great listening is that you're not going to be a great listener if you're trying to win all the time. In an argument, for instance, if somebody brings you something that's really tough, something that's really triggering in the best sense of that word. It gets overused, I think, in our society. But there is a real syndrome of physiological, you might say, like limbic response. When somebody comes to you and says, hey, you know what? You're a jerk. Right? There are things that begin to happen in your brain chemistry and your body chemistry that is intense. And so the natural response is, I call them teddy bears in my workshops. Like when I stress you out, you're going to go to your teddy bears because you want to be comforted by your teddy bear. Well, your teddy bears, when people verbally assault you, are defend yourself, insult them back, argue, problem solve, avoid, retreat. There's all these really unhealthy behaviors we have. They're habits. They're our teddy bears. And you tend to have a few that you love. And so when somebody stresses you out in a relationship or in a conversation, you go to the teddy bear. Very few people have taken the time to build the habit where their teddy bear is listening. So you come to me and you insult me, I'm going to ask you questions. You come to me and are super aggressive with me out of habit through rehearsal, and some really good people have trained me in my life. I'm going to label your emotion. I'm going to summarize what you're telling me to make sure I got it right. And I'm going to probably paraphrase what I think is really important to you, your interest that's motivating your position of I'm a jerk. So if you can change your teddy bears, you can change your relationships. What's interesting is when God throws us something really stressful, we've got our teddy bears. And a lot of times they're not bad. Just like problem solving is not necessarily bad, but in a stressful conversation, it'll fail you, right? So prayers like you're describing, where you pray for that virtue that you think somebody else needs, so that it'll be easier for you to love them. Like that's a teddy bear,
right?
Like to have the humility to say, the reason why I'm not getting along with my brother is because there is something wrong with me. I'm a sinner, and I've got bad habits, and I have deficiencies in some of my virtues. And Lord, show me those. Okay, now you're onto something.
That's exactly right.
It's hard.
It is hard.
I'm not there yet. For those of you wondering,
and it's ongoing. Yeah. But that's also a beautiful thing because there are. It's not like it's a huge uphill battle that I look at when I see all the things that I feel like I need to change or fix or whatever in my own humanity. But I look at it like a spiritual weight room. I could go to the gym and you could pick any muscle, and depending on how often you've worked it out or how exercised it is, it'll be weak or strong. And I feel like all those little moments are weak spiritual muscles that oh man, I didn't realize my calves were so weak.
I skipped leg day.
Right. I should probably
I
should probably start doing this. And I probably don't want to start with those heavy duty exercises. I need to start with something simple and grow that muscle and get strong and build some habit and slowly grow. And it's one little spiritual muscle after another, and not so much, oh man, look at that. Now it's on to that. I really thought I was, but that's not how it works.
No, it's a discipline.
That's not how anything in our humanity works. I can go to my work and I might pick up, 10 different clients that have the same situation, the same married kids, all transitioning to a similar point in their life, tons of different things going on, but they're fairly similar for a young family. And I can get into this way of thinking where I'm doing that, and I can do that really well, where I'm really enhancing that part of my practice.
Yeah, people like talk about the ideal client, right? You get a bunch of the ideal clients, and you can just churn it out.
Yep.
Yeah, sure.
Yep, and then someone else comes in the door who there's a challenge because I hadn't thought about it, or I hadn't been approached with that issue, and now I've got to go and re-strengthen that muscle and go polish that part of, whatever it may be, whatever problem we're trying to solve. But I'm going to have to go and work on that piece of my practice. And you could pick anywhere, and it's like that. It's sports growing up. It's
any skill set.
All right, a real important question. I'm going 15 over, and I get pulled over. what are a few things I can do to
I would
get
pay with
myself
check. I
out?
always pay with check. Oh, that's not what the question is. I'm sorry, I wasn't listening.
No, that's part. You would. Is that number one, or on the 4 things you do when you got pulled over? What is that, 1 or 2? Write a check. No, but in all seriousness, I have probably, and I hope there's no cops listening to this, but I've probably been pulled over like 15 times in my life.
That's a lot of times.
And only gotten 3 tickets.
What if police officers don't even like to write tickets? What if there's a way for them to let you go on about your day and be happy, they prefer that? What if, just throwing that out there.
What if you get pulled over by a car that doesn't have police lights and they get out?
This is hypothetical, right?
It's hypothetical.
This has never happened to you, but maybe some guy you heard of once did this.
I know a guy who was sitting at a stoplight and the light wouldn't change. And it wouldn't change and it wouldn't change. And there's probably 15 cars on both sides lined up. And I was in a hurry and I just went through the light.
This guy was in a hurry.
Oh, shoot. And the guy went through the light. And then some random unmarked red 2-door car, probably 1994, throws on 2 little red and blue lights in the front of his hood and pulls you over, the guy over.
That guy.
And then comes up and says, "Hey, sir, why in the world did you do that? What is going on? It better be important." And the guy says, "Well, I got to go to the bathroom and I'm late for this deal and the light wouldn't turn." He goes, "Your personal problems are no reason for putting other people in danger." And yes, this was me. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is an undercover cop. He's got something on his shirt. I didn't know what he had. And I go and I share my story with you and you're like, dude,
yeah,
he wasn't an undercover cop. He was faking it all along.
2-door red car. And you're like, I was like, was he wearing Simon Security on his shirt? You're like, I don't know what he was wearing on his shirt. But you know what? You were wrong to run the red light.
I didn't need, that got my adrenaline pumping. And I was on I had to go give a talk.
Yeah.
And I was 25 minutes late for it. And so I showed up. I mean, I was all ready to go. I might as well taking a shot of tequila. My heart was pumping.
That's fun.
Because I thought, oh no, if this undercover cop is pulling me over for doing that, this is really bad. Is he calling somebody? Oh no. And he let me go. Thank goodness.
Well, he had to because he didn't have any real tickets. Anyhow.
Don't tell me that. I don't need to know that. Well, Dan, thank you very much for coming on. This was really awesome. I appreciate it. I think our listeners have a lot to learn. I learn something every time we get together and talk. You're a wonderful man. You have a great family, and I am just honored that we could finally get together and do this. So
I'm glad to be your friend. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, everybody, go to Amazon.com and buy both of his books, Life or Death Listening and The 28 Laws of Listening. Dan?
I also have a website, masterlistener.com. You go there, you can see the books and go to Amazon to get them. You can see all my podcast appearances. You can see a little bit about my keynoting and my corporate workshops. And most importantly, you can sign up for coaching. If you feel convicted, you want to become a better listener, I highly recommend the books as a good starting point. But this is what is my philosophy of life, is that a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. That knowledge should become skill, which means you have a new capability, but the skill has to become a habit before you start replacing teddy bears. Because if I put you under stress, your knowledge is gone, your skill will fall apart, but your habitude is what will hold you there. That's what will make you resilient. And then if you're around 2 or 3 other people that are really important to you, then your habits should become a new culture. Go to the website.
Good information for all of us. Dan, thanks again. Hey, everybody, thanks for listening. This is your host, Austin, the Ostomy Guy, and like always, we'll see you next time, and don't forget, everything is grace. Hey everybody, it's your host, the Ostomy Guy. We've been listening to everybody else's story, and I've been kind of hiding from it. But the time is here. My story's out. The Ostomy Guy story, Memoirs of a Bagman. Finally published and ready to buy. www.amazon.com. Go buy one for yourself and one for a loved one. You won't regret it.